Good afternoon, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the ECB today and to extend particularly warm welcome to Martin Wolf. A special thanks also to the American Academy in Berlin and its president, Daniel Benjamin, who has helped set up this event and is with us today. Welcome here, Daniel. For decades, Martin has shaped the global conversation on economics, finance, and the future of open societies. As chief economics commentator at the Financial Times, his analysis has guided policymakers, academics, market participants, and citizens alike. His voice is internationally recognized, not just for its expertise, but for its integrity. Martin has consistently helped us understand the deeper forces reshaping the world economy, from globalization and financial crisis to the tensions now testing the foundations of liberal democracy. His work is marked by the ability to connect economics with politics, society and geopolitics in a way that illuminates the stakes for all of us. Today's lecture, The Crisis of the Liberal World Order, could not be more timely. As his intervention is going to illustrate, we are living through a period of profound transformation. We are the erosion of long-standing certainties, the return of great power rivalry, the shift in global economic gravity, and the growing pressures on democratic institutions. Understanding these dynamics is essential for shaping the policies and choices that lie ahead of us. Martin, we are really honored to have you with us and grateful for the clarity and courage with which you continue to analyze the challenges of our age. Thank you for joining us today at the ECB. The floor is yours.
First of all, thank you very much for that extraordinarily kind, almost embarrassingly kind introduction. It honestly never occurred to me in my life that I would be delivering a lecture in any central bank, but certainly in a central bank of this importance and significance. I remember that I wrote a great deal long ago about the creation of the euro, which I thought was a very risky project. And I've been at the European Central Bank many times since its foundation. I often met Wim Duisenberg here and Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, who was a very close friend of mine. And being here and able to give a lecture when Christine Lagarde, also somebody I regard as a good and close friend, is present, it's a tremendous honor. And before I start, this is a very broad lecture. It's not going to discuss monetary policy at all, because believe it or not, in this context, I think it's secondary. It's about how I see the evolution of the world system, and particularly what forces are shaping it, as it were, among states and within states, and how those interact. So it is indeed about politics and economics, and if there is one thing that I feel I've learned most clearly in my life as first a professional economist at the World Bank, and subsequently as an analyst of world trade, and then at the FT, is that it is impossible to separate economics from politics. And I think it's probably the most important thing economists can know, that their domain, and that's particularly true if you're talking about macroeconomics, as of course you are here, can never be separated from politics. The two things go together. So with that very quick introduction, let me give you this lecture, which I think will take about 40 minutes, maybe 42. It's got a lot in it. I know it's quite compressed, but you here, of course, and those listening will certainly be able to pick it all up, because you'll be pretty familiar with a lot of the material I'm using. So I'm going to start with a couple of quotations. And the first quotation is from somebody you will certainly never have heard of. There may be someone here who has, but there's no reason why you should. But it's a quotation I particularly enjoy and a great deal of influence on me. Jan Tumler was a Czech refugee from communism, who became the chief economist of the GATT during the 1980s. And that was the glory days of the GATT. It was when the Uruguay round, the last important multilateral trade negotiation of the post-war era, was prepared and not finished. It was finished after he left in the early 90s. And Jan was a true liberal, much more radically so than me. But I remember very well discussions we had at that time about the nature of learning from history as societies and what happened with the lessons. And he made this remark to me a couple of times, and I think it's incredibly important. It has informed my thinking, for instance, about financial crises. So I think a financial crisis is becoming quite likely now because far too many people who work in trading rooms don't remember the last one. Anyway, the quote is, it's not true that we don't learn from history. We do, and then we forget. And part of the way we forget is we die and our grandchildren ultimately inherit the position. And I think that's very important. And the second quote I want to offer is a pretty extraordinary quotation, given the history of the country concerned, the constitutional apparatus of this country, and its central role in part of what I'll talk about, the establishment of a liberal and increasingly democratic world order after the Second World War. Named the President of the United States, Donald Trump, who said last summer, I have the right to do anything I want to do. I'm the President of the United States. And there is really no doubt whatsoever he believes that. And that's quite a remarkable and significant statement to come from this man. So how did we get here? So my lecture is divided into 5 parts. It's quite journalistic. I am a journalist after all. The first part is how I think about where we are in a historical context. And the history I'm going to talk about is the late 19th and early 20th centuries, predominantly in Europe. And that first part I call history rhymes. And just to make clear why I'm using that sentence, 2-word sentence, for those of you who don't know, I suspect most of you do know, very famously, the American writer Mark Twain, I think the greatest American writer, but I won't get into that, said, history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. The second thing I want to talk about is where we are now, what the world looks like today. And then I'm going to talk about how we got to where we are now. And then I'll talk briefly about what is at stake, what I think the issues are, the big issues are now. And then at the very last, what is to be done. And that will focus on the EU. And of course, it goes without saying, I am very well aware that my country is not a member of the EU. It was over my dead body, except that I didn't die, but we left, alas. Okay, so what is this rhyme I need? The argument I'm making is that if you live through a period, so we're talking about after the Industrial Revolution, so the last 200 years or so, which has been a period of revolutionary transformation in the history of the world. There hasn't been anything like the last 200 years in human history, so far as we know, and it's very well hidden if it has existed. This generated periods of wild transformation, and particularly 2 great periods of globalization, market liberalization, and rapid technological change, the late 19th to the middle 20th century, and again, the last 30 or 40 years. In such periods, you see huge changes in relative economic power. You also see, partly because of those changes in relative economic power, emerging clashes between liberal and interventionist paradigms of how economic policy should be conducted. And you also see huge, profound social and cultural changes. And I'm going to argue, I understand the complexity of this, that this happened between 1870 and 1914 and ended up with a period of colossal turmoil in Europe, which spread to the whole world, also in the United States, to the whole world, which ended the whole late 19th, early 20th century globalization and liberalization. And again, it's been happening since 1980, and I argue it's accelerating. So we're again, as we were in the world was and Europe was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in an era of declining trust in liberalism and democracy and rising nationalism and populism. If you want a literary expression written after the beginning of the disaster of what was happening in the earlier period, Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain is the perfect literary expression of exactly what I'm talking about. So if you want to understand the social, cultural context, and particularly the intellectual context for such revolutions, that's a pretty good place to start. Personally, I think it's the most important novel of the 20th, sorry, let me just make sure, yeah, okay. So I'm going to start with the history rhymes thing. So this is a chart which shows the ratio of world trade to world GDP since the early 19th century. It's a chart which you've probably seen in different forms over this period. And the basically you can see, though they're very different in shape, two periods of globalization, by which I mean periods, and I don't have other time, I can't go through all the other measures of globalization, financial and so forth. It's not possible in this lecture. I'll just focus on trade, which is a very powerful indicator. So this is trade in goods. So what this shows is that from the middle of the 19th century to the Second World War, the ratio of trade to GDP first reached an unparalleled level and reached a peak just at the time of the First World War. Thereafter came a collapse, a very prolonged collapse, started in the 20s and of course collapsed completely in the 30s and into the Second World War. And at the end of this, the ratio of world trade to GDP had fallen to where it was almost 100 years earlier. And this was the result of the disintegration of the world system that began with the First World War. I obviously don't go through the history, but we know that happened. And the idea, then we had a partial recovery in the Western world, which you can see going on to about the 1970s to 80s, a partial recovery of the world system, huge recovery in the Western world, under the Marshall Plan, the creation of the EU, the first GATT rounds and so forth. And then the true explosion that began in the 1980s with the opening up of China and similar economies to reach a level of openness of trade to GDP. And capital flows, by the way, will look similar to this, so in different ways with migration, to reach a level about twice what it had ever been before. So that's the history, very briefly, as measured in this, of the ups and downs of the liberal world economy as measured by trade, but the other measures would look pretty similar. And the key point here, of course, is that at the end, and we're now stable since the global financial crisis, the ratio is stabilized. It hasn't collapsed yet, but the globalization process, the increased integration has stopped on every measure since about 2008-9. We aren't globalizing more. Now, the second chart shows the relationship between globalization, and again, I discuss this at great length in my book, the crisis of democratic capitalism, I don't really need to stand here. I can just walk around. So that's much better for me. I can actually see my text. And I hate standing behind a pulpit anyway. So the second shows a very interesting relationship, which I argue, and I don't have time to go through these arguments in great detail here, is not an accident correlation between democratization of politics and the opening of the world economy. Basically, what they share is a belief in freedom, individual choice, and confidence in the future. Both these things are needed for these sorts of processes to be conceded and to function. And what it basically shows, the brown line is taken from the Polity 4 database, which I used in my book, and it shows the proportion of the world's regimes, obviously far fewer in the 19th century than the more recently because of decolonization, the end of colonial empire. But you can see that in the course of the 19th century, there was an enormous move, and it continued just out of the First World War, towards democracy. It's worth noting under the Policy 4 database and any similar database, the number of even marginally democratic regimes in the world in 1800 was essentially zero. So this has been one of the great transformations of the last 225 years. The democracy has become normal. And you can see by 1870 it was 10%, then it moved to 40%, then there was a progressive collapse, and by between 1940 and 1945, because of fascism and because of communism, the number of regimes had gone back pretty well to where they were 80 years, actually it was 80 years earlier. I'm just showing the 70 years earlier. And then there was a recovery immediately after the war because Europe was liberated. Then we had a long static period. And then from 1980 to just with the globalization, and this is shown in the other two lines, which show another ratio of trade over GDP, we see this explosion in the proportion of world regimes that were democratic, which continued again till it stabilized about 2008 or 9. There's some disagreement, but that's basically when it stabilized and as I will show, has fallen back. So the two things seem to a remarkable degree to have coincided. Eras of globalization were eras of democratization. Of course, if you look at the number of countries that were democratic, the number of countries that have been democratic recently has far succeeded ever before in history. So it was an era of democratization as well as an era of liberalization economically. Now, then I want to introduce the most obvious similarity between the period, the precursors of the end of the first globalization, as it's called. The first globalization, this great period in the 19th and early 20th century of expansion trade, expansion commerce. One of the things that happened, and it is remarkably similar to what's happening now, is a total transformation of relative economic power. Very, very quick, and in my view, facilitated significantly by imitating and absorbing technology and ideas from Britain, and then developing far beyond them. And the most remarkable cases and the most significant of cases of this was the rise of America and the rise of Germany within Europe, which completely changed the balance of power in the world and in Europe. Obviously, the transformation of Germany, which moved from having half the size of the economy of Britain in 1870 to the same size as Britain, with a much stronger industry by 1914, is shown with the blue line relative to the purple line. And behind it, you have the great rise of the world's superpower. And the United States had become the world's superpower definitively by 1900, and nobody in Europe had worked that out. Remarkably few had worked that out. And ultimately, of course, after a long period of history, which we all know, US emerged as the dominant hegemon And it sorted out essentially the instability generated in Europe by its inability to resolve the tensions among the European great powers. Now, the second chart shows what's happened more recently. I'm using PPP. I think this is the best measure. Obviously, if you use other measures, the relative sizes would look different, but I think it brings out the relative point. Back in 1980, the Western world was the world economically. It was the world. I won't give you the relative figures, but on any measure, the world economy was overwhelmingly dominated by the Western powers. Europe and America were roughly similar, but America was a concentrated continental superpower, and you can see this here. I've used the G7 here rather than putting in the EU as such. But I've also put in China and India, and you can see the rise of China. And this is shares of world GDP. For various reasons, I've used that as my indicator. And the basic point is that 20 years ago, China was irrelevant. 25 years ago. And now it's a colossus. And this is a stupendous change in world economic power, and it has gone along with, though I don't present papers, data on that, the transformation of the weight in manufacturing in the world, where China is unquestionably now the superpower. In fact, its manufacturing sector is basically as big as the G7 together. So this is a transformation of the world as profound as the rise of the US, in my view. Not quite, but very similar. And it creates, for the first time, two rival continental scale superpowers. And this is the biggest thing that has happened to the world, I think, the last two decades, and I think it's the most important shaping event, single shaping event, but though it's not the only one. Now, this chart shows US trade policy over much the same period as the information I've given you about globalization. This is US average effective tariff rates in 1790. It comes from the Yale Budget Lab. You've probably seen this very frequently, charts like this. And it shows that in the period when, which Donald Trump thinks was the period of greatest success for America, the late 19th century, and it was a period of extraordinary success, the US was spectacularly protectionist. Its average tariffs were about 30% effective tariff. Then there was a period of liberalization in the early 20th century, and a big rise in the 30s, and then the long liberalization which started in the 30s. And then very recently, which you've got the line at the end, this sudden spike back upwards to where protection was about 100 years ago. That's quite a remarkable reversal. Now, the big point I wanted to make here before moving on to that is those tariff policies weren't some sort of accident. They expressed a very profound commitment to economic nationalism and industrial policy, with the tariff as the principal instrument, very much what Donald Trump believes. He really does think 19th century. And the ideas that underpin that were, of course, associated with two particular intellectual figures, Hamilton in America and Liszt here in Germany. And they were the proponents of interventionism, above all tariff policy intervention, but not only using the emerging banking system to develop the economy. They were believers in aggressive industrialization. And of course, Marxism and socialism also reshaped the political debates over this long period. And in the end of it, liberalism got completely eroded as a set of beliefs. And that's what Thomas Mann's novel is about. And of course, in today's world, China's success, seen also similarly as the result of a mixture of protectionism and interventionism of a brilliant kind, is also clearly driving very similar views of these guys are cheating, we should follow them. again, a sign, and that's what happened to Britain. Britain became protectionist in response to the protectionism of, as they saw it, of Germany and the United States. So that's history rhymes, and in a way it's the most, maybe the most important thing I'm saying, that in many very important ways, it seems to me, what we're going through now, in different contexts, different time, has very clear echoes of what happened at the end of the first period of globalization through the 30-year collapse that followed. Now, and here, if I think about it now, I would say the most important question is, can we bring China and the US into a single functioning system? Because it's the only way we can replace the sort of hegemony we had with the US and Europe working with the US in the post-war period. Now I'm going to talk about where we are now. We'll go through relatively quickly because I've been far too slow. First point, politics can never be separated from economics and vice versa. We are in a so far mild but decided democratic recession, a term Larry Diamond of Stanford has used. So we're seeing the reaction against democracy. We're of course seeing the reaction against liberalism. You can see that in America's trade policy every day, and the discussion here in Europe associated with China. Populism is on the rise, especially right-wing populism, again, of course, a feature of the early 20th century. Economic nationalism are also, and interventionism on the rise. In all, what we're seeing is an anti-liberal counter-revolution across the board, most dramatically, I think, in the US. And the most important reversal is in the US, which is the guarantor of the post-World War II order. So this is where we are. So I'll just go back. Oh, sorry. Apologize. So I'll just go through this very quickly. Oh, what's going crazy? Okay, this is, I just want you to focus. This is on the rise of democracy. I've given you a very brief synopsis of this. This comes from the VDEM database. Again, it goes back to 1794, actually. The big thing about this chart is it decomposes the elements of a liberal world, and particularly liberal democracy, into its components: private civil liberties, judicial checks on government, legislative checks on government, rule of law, democratic elections, and liberal democracy overall, which is the blue line. And it basically shows the long rise of democracy, the collapse in the 30s and 40s, that's already obvious, and then the incredible surge in democratization in the late 20th century, up reaching a peak about 20 years ago. And now it's falling. It's not dramatically falling, but if you look at the various components, it's falling across the world. And you can all see, if you think about it, what we're measuring, what people are measuring when they see this. But there's something else that has been happening which may be more significant and pointed, which is the rise of populism. And for this purpose, the purpose of this analysis, populism is defined as a politics built around anti-elitism. A politics is built around the idea that we have these elites, they're corrupt, indifferent, hostile, incompetent, and if you give me, the populist leader, the power I need to take these people on, I will transform the society in the way you want. And that's what the left and right-wing populists tend to have in common. This comes from a very important piece of research done by 3 German economists, Schullerich, Funkert, Schullerich, and Trebisch, on populism in the last 100 years. And all I wanted to show you is, if you look at the purple, which is right-wing populism, and red, which is the left-wing populism, the proportion of governments that have been elected in the last, the same will be true if we went up beyond 2020, has reached extraordinarily high levels, indeed unprecedented, in the proportion that are both right and left-wing populism, but right-wing populism has been far and away the most effective. We have moved into a populist era. And I should note, because it's important in this context, and from the point of these analysts, Hitler was also a populist, as thus defined. Of course, he was vastly more than that. Now, one of the characteristics of a populist government of the type I've described, they've defined, is when the person in question gets into power, he starts ruling by decree. And he rules by decree by using emergency provisions. And this is one of the most remarkable. This chart shows the most recent presidents of the 21st century, and red is Trump 1, and the line that shoots up on the at the end of the red line is the first 7 or 8 months of the Trump presidency. And this shows the number of emergencies that have been declared in order to allow the president to rule by decree. The emergency over the southern border, over drug controls, over energy policy, over drugs from Canada, drugs from China, and drugs from Mexico. The International Criminal Court was an emergency. Trade imbalances are an emergency. That's what the Supreme Court has just ruled out. And Brazil's prosecution of its ex-president Bolsonaro for trying to overthrow the election is also a national emergency. In other words, it can be fair to say that the present administration of the United States has used and abused the emergency provisions in US law to an astonishing degree. And that's exactly what you would expect a right-wing populist to do. Now, how significant is the backsliding in this, the most important case in the world right now? Well, this chart I've taken from my colleague, John Byrne-Murdoch, who's, I think, absolutely magnificent. And this is built on a very complicated scorecard he's put together of backsliding from liberal democratic norms of the type that I showed you in the earlier chart from VDEM for 5 interesting cases: Hungary, Venezuela, Russia, Turkey, and the US. They all are dramatic cases of backsliding. Of course, they start from 0, so that doesn't mean they start at the same level. But the key point he made in his wonderful article on this is that in the first, really basically year of the second term of the US, the backsliding has been faster, though it's not as far as in any of those other cases. It is a remarkable case of democratic backsliding, and that is part of where we are. I also want to show one other aspect, which gets back to the trade side of this, my measure of globalization. So this is a measure used by Global Trade Alert of what they call harmful trade policy interventions, mostly quantitative controls of various kinds and other regulations trying to halt imports. And the main point I wanted to make here is actually the level has been very high since the financial crisis, but it has doubled since 2000. Globally, we're moving very clearly, it's not just in America, away from the liberal paradigm that we believed 40 years ago or 30 years ago in the 90s when the WTO was created, we had moved into. So in terms of democracy and in terms of economic liberalism, look globally, and I can't go into other aspects, but they all fit into, we are in a period of backsliding, which is quite striking. A bit like, though we're nowhere net as far, what happened in the interwar period. Now, how did we get here? What drove us in this direction? Well, I'm going to argue very briefly there are the 4 elements, and that's part of the 4 elements that came together in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century and are coming together again. First, liberal globalization creates opportunities for rapid catch-up, and then the countries that caught up start to go ahead, and that's what happened dramatically in the cases I showed you in the late 19th and early 20th century, and it's what's happening again now, but this time it's China and India. It's non-Western. So the catch-up process is a decline of the West. That's just what it is. Secondly, running together liberal societies, democracy, and liberal economies is quite difficult. In my discussion, in my book, I call this a difficult marriage, or a marriage of complementary opposites. Basically, I can't go through this argument. Democracy and capitalism need each other, but they're in tension with each other as well. And that has to be understood if we think about how we run our societies. Technological and social change is causing huge upheavals for our society. And I'm going to cover some of them, just a few. Slowing growth, deindustrialization, low fertility, aging, and pressures for mass migration. I can only touch on those. Personalized media, which are transforming the consumption of information, and AI is now set to transform our economy further. All these sorts of changes, but in different guise because it was a different history, also were working in the earlier 20th century. So our political, economic, and social institutions are struggling to handle the comprehensive economic, social, political, and cultural changes we're living through. And that was very much the theme of my book. Now, let's just talk briefly about this difficult marriage of democracy with plutocracy, with capitalism that generates huge inequalities of wealth, because it's part of it. The history of complex societies is, of course, one of extreme inequality of political and economic power. By complex societies, I mean the societies that emerged after the agrarian revolution. And when you got extreme inequality of political and economic power, what tended to happen is the power made people wealthy and the wealth gave people power. Power and wealth were the same thing. The richest person in the Roman Empire was the Roman emperor, period. And that was generally true in such societies. When we started on democracy, we were trying to do something unbelievably revolutionary. Well, pretty revolutionary. They tried it in Athens in a different way, namely to have power and the distribution of power separate to a large degree from the distribution of wealth. In a democracy, there is the assumption of fundamental citizen equality, but obviously there's not economic inequality in a capitalist society. So that's why I say democratic capitalism is a difficult marriage of complementary opposites. Now, again, I don't have time to go through, gigantic wealth was returned. We have plutocracy, and given the need to placate the masses, the emergence of plutocracy has quite naturally generated another complementary power structure, which is charismatic autocracy within our democracies. That, by the way, is what happened in the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC. I wrote about that in a column that appeared in March 2016, not by accident. I was a classicist long before I became an economist. Okay, now let me just go through very quickly, really quickly, some elements of this. The first change I wanted to talk about is, as the trigger for the dissatisfaction with democracy, slowing growth. So this basically shows, the first rectangles show GDP per head growth between 1980 and 2007. That's the dark blue. The next column shows the GDP per head growth between 2007 and 24. And the red column, all negative, shows the change. And basically, growth rates in all the major Western countries, and including Japan in this, have collapsed. The US least, but they have collapsed. So we're in a much more slowly growing economic system than existed before. The second thing that has happened related to many forces, but including the rise of China, is a dramatic collapse in the proportion of the labor force working in industry. And I think that has profound social and political effects because it hollows out to a very significant degree the political power, the organized political power of the working classes, which are a very important element in the mid-20th century social democratic systems that emerged across the West. And you can see how dramatic those declines are from the pink rectangle. And the third thing that I wanted, is we have had tremendous difficulty, though it's varied across country, in coping with another set of changes which we really didn't prepare for and think about, which is the revolution of immigration, which has created an enormous rise in the foreign-born share of populations across the Western world. Countries varied in how well they did with this. Some did very well with relatively high levels of immigration. Some did much worse. But it's a profound change which we've been really very bad in many cases in handling. Those are just three of many elements, which I discuss in my book, of the transformation of our polities in the context of what has become, particularly here in this continent, slow growth. Now, so what is at stake as a result of these transformations? Global economic and global power and in our societies. Well, we've ended up, and I've got a lot more to say on this, in an era of revolutionary, or I would say counter-revolutionary upheaval. And this revolution undermines prospects for four fundamental aspects of the world we used to think we lived in. It's generated a big rise in anti-democratic sentiment, and particularly deep distrust for the elites that run the institutions of democratic societies, such as the people here. You are the elites for this purpose. They threaten prosperity. I'll come to this in a moment. They threaten peace, because extremely adversary relations of interventionist, protectionist states with one another, and they threaten cooperation. So let me just talk about this very briefly, and this is just to give I won't go into this in any great detail. This just gives a little bit more on the democracies. This is much more detailed than the earlier charts I showed, and it divides democracy, again, it's from VDEM, into liberal democracies, the sort of countries that have really functioning institutions, funding legal systems, individual rights, functioning electoral system, really liberal democracies, electoral democracies where the elections count, but the rights of individual citizens, the rule of law and so forth are in question. Electoral autocracies are systems in which people are elected, but basically they are sort of elected, but the elections are rigged and the government is an autocracy, and closed autocracies are a system like China. The basic point is we have an awful lot of democracy, quote unquote, but some of them aren't very democratic. Really aren't very, and that makes them very, very fragile. The liberal democracies, truly liberal democracies, according to this measure, with the whole panoply of individual rights and all those, are really not only quite a small proportion of total regimes, they're declining quite rapidly, and you see that in the bottom right corner. So this is a picture which says, well, when you look at all these democracies, they're not that democratic, and when they're under real pressure, they can collapse. And we've seen that, if I may say so, very clearly on the other side of the Atlantic, as I've shown you. Now, what is at stake? I said prosperity, and again, I'm returning to the paper that I started with, the paper by these three German economists, I think all of whom at the Kiel Institute, and they sort of asked themselves, well, when these populist autocrats get into power, what do they do to the economy? And what you have to remember, what they tend to be against, that's how they got there, they're against the institutions that are the core of a liberal system. They're against all the independent technocratic institutions of governance. They think they should control them directly. They're against fiscal and monetary stability. Who cares about that? Just spend money and buy the support of the people. They're against the rule of the law because it constrains them, and they don't want to be constrained. And they generate extreme uncertainty, and that extreme uncertainty generates very significant economic costs. And it seems to me pretty clear Donald Trump has been doing all these things. More extreme populist regimes than this are, of course, fascistic, and they go far further, and they tend to assail science and most forms of independent inquiry and independent media. And well, what is the cost of all this? Well, this chart shows what happens, and they say, well, the year zero is when the regime in question transforms from a normal democracy to being a populist democracy. And they look at left-wing populists and right-wing populists. They use a synthetic alternative, classic economic methodology with which you'll be familiar, and they show very clearly that over long periods, 15 years, because it's very difficult to get rid of these regimes, these populist governments fail. They generate very significant cumulative declines in economic performance, and that makes them unpopular, but it makes the country unsuccessful and very, very angry. And it's very difficult to get back from there to stability. That's prosperity. What is at stake? Prosperity for the world. It is worth stressing, I'm getting very close to the end of this, that the period of the great liberalization, I'm going here from 1950 to 2020, which started with the liberalization and opening up of the Western world and the other allies of the United States, the beginning of rapid modernization in countries like Japan, Korea, and so forth, and then the post-1990 period in 2000, this has been a period of staggering economic success. Well, this is unambiguous. So this shows world average GDP per head after World War II at purchasing power parity using the Madison Project database, PPP numbers. Essentially, the point I wanted to make here, this period, which is now very clearly from what we're seeing coming from the US and possibly elsewhere, coming to an end, saw a 5-fold increase in average world GDP per head, despite pretty close to a doubling of the world's population. There's simply nothing like this in the history of the world. It was vastly more successful than the 19th and first half of the 20th century, let alone anything before that. So we, I think, should be very proud of what the West produced globally, and much of this increase was, of course, in the developing world. And then finally, of course, peace. The move back to a world of interventionist great powers is also likely to be a move to a world of war. Indeed, we are already seeing this, in realpolitik great powers. We've seen it in Ukraine, and we're seeing it, my God, we're seeing it now in the Middle East. What we're seeing now is obviously a continuation of the Gaza war. This is now a multi-year war and getting worse, and we all know what's going on in Ukraine. And war is not only a physical process. It can also be fought with tariffs, sanctions, and other costly means. Economic warfare is also war. It's different, better in some sense, and that is also what is now happening. And its objectives of these processes of war, both physical war and economic war, will also frequently be economic, as well as more narrowly those of national security in the traditional sense. So we are moving in, as a result of what I would say, a world of hostile great powers in which others are under great threat. And finally, of course, cooperation, one of the main themes of the post-World War II order, what was created after the Second World War, which I think brought these remarkable success, was the idea of institutionalized international cooperation. And I really don't have to explain that here, because the ECB is an extraordinary exemplar of that. You wouldn't have thought this was possible in 1950. And this was shown in the creation of the UN, Bretton Woods institutions, the GATT, sorry, I'm missing a T, the WTO, the World Health Organization, climate change conferences, etc., and of course the EU and everything associated with it, which was astonishing. And the idea was we do better by cooperating. The key idea was that we need to cooperate in order to provide global and regional public goods. And that is, of course, radically incompatible with a world of competing great powers, accountable to nobody else and for nothing they do, which is very much what led to the catastrophe in the early 20th century. Yet I fear that is the world we're moving into, and we see it every day. And so development, climate, trade, and health cooperation, and many things are now at risk if these processes are not reversed. And this is the very last sheet, so I'm about 2 minutes over, I apologize. Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, very recently in Davos called for middle powers to respond to what he called the rupture, which is essentially what I've been talking about in a different way. And I have argued in many columns since then and before, the EU has a unique potential role as leader of the world's middle powers because it's in itself a cooperative structure of middle powers. And everybody except the US and China is a middle power. It's a wonderful quote, and I've temporarily forgotten who said it, Europe is divided, and of course include Britain, into small countries and countries that don't yet realize they're small countries. And I think, you will immediately remember who had said it, but I think it's very, very pregnant. So, so many middle powers do not wish to follow the US in its inward-looking direction, and they need to be defended from it. And this gives the EU, I think, a specific economic giant, what it was created to be after the catastrophes of the early 20th century, a new potential role in the world. But if it is to play that role, it must become stronger and more independent internally and externally, and it must do that without becoming a normal great power. Is this possible? I have no idea, but it seems to me the challenge for the next generation of Europeans. Thank you very much for listening to me.
I suppose that you want a little bit of water.
Sorry? Oh, yeah, a little water might be a good idea. I'll do that.
Okay, I can open it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think that it has been, you know, a totally different perspective for a central bank. Here, where we analyze models about the output gap. If I tell you, you know, the kind of excitement that we have in the executive board when the issue of the natural interest rate comes up, you know, among you know, a couple of my colleagues in the executive board, and it's totally unobservable. So you can discuss for centuries. You know, I have you know, we have 37 minutes. We are going to pick up some questions from the audience online as well. Yeah, Esther is going to give me a helping hand in that regard. But I would like to start and taking advantage of my position as moderator now. What do you think about the events of the day? What do you think about what's happening since you know, the strikes on Iran? What's your reading of you know, how this can evolve, the potential consequences for the world economy? I think that it would be, you know, extremely interesting for all of us.
So, one of the most difficult things to do, and I'm sure I'm guilty of this often in trying to do these very big picture things, because I feel that the virtue of my position is I can address these gigantic questions and not think very hard about the natural rate of interest. Thinking about unobservable pieces of information sort of drives me crazy. Of course, I've read the literature too. But anyway, is to work out what is genuinely new and what is really a continuation of the old. And I'd make 2 points, one of which is, I think, true, both of which are true. People would argue, and I think there is a lot of truth in it, that this liberal world order that I've talked about, like all orders, rests ultimately on coercive power. There has to be power then. And the power, of course, and I wrote about this in my book on globalization, comes from states. The power structure of our world is that of states, which are, at least in our world, predominantly nation states. But in a world of rival states, the most important states are the most powerful. And in the post-war system, and I've discussed that at great length, as I said in my earliest book on globalization, did depend, it's a matter of fact, on US power. And the stabilization of Europe in the end, after the Second World War, after the Cold War, obviously depended on US power. And that's police power. And that gave the United States great responsibility, incredible influence, and the capacity to make very large mistakes. That's just a reality. And that gets to the second question. Are these mistakes, because I think they are important mistakes, but we can discuss that, different from the ones the US made in the past? Because I've been having this discussion with one the gentleman who came with me in the last couple of days, the US has a long history in the post-war era. So it has had the extraordinary successes of the Marshall Plan, NATO, and all that stuff, and the liberal order and the WTO, all this stuff can go on forever, but it also has conducted a pretty long series of failed wars. And some of them are catastrophic. The Vietnam War, which I remember in detail. I was an adult when it started. So the Vietnam War, the first Iraq War was a success, well-defined, coherent, internationally agreed. But then you look at the second Iraq War, you look at the Afghanistan War, 20 years and total defeat. The constant interventions in Grenada, if I remember correctly. So what we're seeing now isn't new. It isn't that new. One could say that the previous periods, the US mistake was to go in with ludicrously overambitious objectives, which ended up with endless wars, forever wars. Now this time they've gone in with, for us, I can see no objective at all. At least I can't work out what the objective is, except to get rid of decapitate the leadership and somehow get rid of the nuclear program. Is that going to be worse than what they've done in the past when we look back on this 5, 10 years from now? Quite possibly. I mean, I can imagine scenarios when the outcome of this will be a truly enormous catastrophe, but it might not be. What you can say is this, to me, this is an example of the constant tendency towards military intervention of the US, which the Chinese are not doing yet, and their tendency to make a mess of it. What is new here is, even at the beginning, I think it is extraordinarily incoherent. I'm just incomprehensible. Just written a column about it, and it is impossible to make sense of. So, in other words, I'm genuinely, profoundly bewildered about what's going on. And that's the sense I'm getting from reading the most intelligent American commentators. They don't understand what's going on, and they don't understand what its consequences will be because they don't know what the people doing it are trying to do. And my view is the most important context of this, which I put into it, is that it should make every decision making about the world who matters say, what is the US up to? Here's the world's most important country. What the hell is it up to? That really terrifies me.
Very good. Well, just perhaps to complement, because to put a little bit of a positive note, well, the Americans have to come twice to Europe to settle our issues. So it's
the US got dragged in very, very, very unwillingly to Europe, and after they thought they'd sorted everything out with the rather mistaken Versailles, well, I won't go into the Versailles Treaty, they had to get dragged back. I assume, I hope or pray that Europe has not yet forgotten the lessons of history.
Very good. So now we are going to open the floor for questions. I don't know whether, there I have, one question. We can collect 2 or 3. There, I think that we have a micro. Please introduce yourself and
thank you.
Ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Dirk Broeders. I work here at the ECB in risk management. And like many commentators, you're talking about democracy running into default. And in financial terms, we would do a restructuring. So is there anything you can think of how we can restructure democracy? Because in the end, people vote populist leaders to fix the democratic system.
Very good. Another one. There, I see another hand. There, you know, okay, there is another micro. Very good.
Thank you. You had this graph about the purchasing power and the five-fold increase since the 1950s. And the question is, this is the total increase, but how does this being distributed, and to what extent the non-proper distribution after a certain point in time creates a lot of this populism that we're talking about? So to what extent this populism is linked really to the economic realities that some of the people might face or might feel that they face in the economies? Because you demonstrated this big success, but this big success, the narrative is that it's not being equally distributed after a certain point in time, and this creates a lot of economic realities in the West that are driving populism because of people feeling economically insecure, or they do feel that they don't have a, let's say, a fair cut of the pie, that it keeps increasing. And then at some point in time, they say, I don't care if the pie increases any longer, we can just destroy everything and start again.
Is the table that the chart you refer to the one of the rise of GDP per head? Or?
Yes, exactly. Because the rise of GDP per head, but
the distribution, yes, that's a very good point.
Plutocracy, and about plutocracy is just about how you're sharing this GDP in proportionally in the societies, and to what extent this big success, as you describe it, certainly the living standards now are much more different than what they were in the 50s, but to what extent this at some point in time started flattening for the average person, let's put it that way.
So these two little questions. Your fascinating question. What I think, I mean, my immediate reaction in thinking this may work for this, when a company is insolvent, you mentioned that as an example, we know what a resolution means because we have a system that defines it, and to a first order, what we do is convert a lot of debt into equity, and if that's not enough, it's sold off for whatever it can get, and if it's worth nothing, it's closed. Very clear processes. Now, the problem is, if the political system goes bankrupt in some meaningful sense, and sometimes it might be quite meaningful in the sense they can no longer service their debt and they default, but often it's not. By definition, there isn't anything to resolve it because there aren't resolution and process. Well, there are resolution processes of a certain sort for states, if they're small states and they get chewed over by the IMF. But for major states, it doesn't work like that. And this raises the most profound question of all: who's responsible for states when states fail? And that's, in my view, in a way, what's being raised by what's going on now in the Middle East. So you're asking, I think, you were asking already, but you're asking a question: when a political system based on certain ideas, in this case, democratic elections, doesn't work anymore in the sense it is no longer either legitimate to the public or able to handle the problems it confronts, and they're obviously related, what do you do? And I think the parallel with the resolution idea, I can understand it, but it's much more complicated, obviously. I mean, immeasurably more complicated. And I've thought a lot about that in writing my book. And I did put forward some ideas or support certain ideas about mechanisms that might be better than the democratic mechanisms we have. And so I came to discuss the idea of making far more greater use of citizens' assemblies as a way of bringing people together. And I thought a lot about whether there's things we can learn from what seems to me obviously the most successful democracy in the world, namely Switzerland, about the use of referenda. And I've also thought about whether the problem is our states are just too big. But we can't fragment forever because you need some big states. So, but now I think all those are perfectly worthwhile ideas, but I'm reasonably clear in my own mind that we don't at the moment have a better idea. I have a long discussion in my book on the problems dictatorships have. Pretty obvious problems, succession problems, getting rid of incompetent leaders. I can give you so many examples. Rectifying mistakes, because the leader will never accept that they've made a mistake. So we have a competition worldwide between defective regimes. But my summation will be, I would try the ideas I've mentioned, see what we can do with them. But you're asking the most profound question in political theory, which is what form of governance works best and what do you do when it starts to fail? And who and how can you do it, since by definition the state is sovereign? And I don't think there is an answer, and that's the tragedy of human organization. We are utterly dependent on entities, states, that we can't really control properly and can't make work properly. That seems to me the tragedy. And all this was covered pretty amazingly well with an implausible answer in the first great book written on this whole subject, which is Plato's Republic, which I quote at great length. Of course, he was a passionate anti-democrat. Now, the second question is, I think, a very profound one. What makes people unhappy? I think that's the question. And I think the answer to that, and I discuss a lot of this, is we don't really know, because there are so many possibilities, and there are different people who are unhappy for different reasons. I think it is plausible that relative positions in the distribution matter a lot to people, not just absolute positions. And so big rises in inequality are themselves problematic. I think that's clear. How far that goes, if most people's relative positions are unchanged, say 95% of people's relative positions don't change much, or maybe even 99.9% don't change much, but the 0.1% share of the wealth of an income triples. Does it really matter to the other 99.9%? Because that's a lot of what's happened. If you read Paul Krugman's recent writings, very, very interesting on this, he just brings out how much of the increased inequality very recently in the US, which is obviously exemplary, is just the staggering wealth at the very, very top of the income distribution. This clearly has enormous power implications. There's no doubt about it. If people are worth $300 or $400 billion, they have unbelievable power. But whether that matters to people, I don't know. So it's not just the inequality, it's what inequality matters. I have argued in my book that the most, which is based on a lot of sociological work, I didn't make this up, that the most important thing is when people in the middle to lower middling of the distribution, I've got a quote from Aristotle about this, experience what they see as downward relative and absolute mobility, then you have a very, very big problem. And therefore, the combination of relatively slow growth with rapid deindustrialization with it, the whole set of jobs that went with that, is particularly politically relevant because it destroys a very important part of the stabilizing group of society, which is the middle class. And I fear that AI is going to do the same. And this is to a different part of the middle class, but a very, very important part. So I tend to think it's not just inequality. It's not, and it's not just relative, it's also what happens absolutely, and where it happens and to how many people. So that's a complicated answer, and I think there's a lot more. But we don't fully know. There are how important, but I'm inclined to think that there is one respect, at least, in which the rate of growth also matters. And this is that once you have a rapidly growing society, not only can you have big shifts in the relative distribution in which nonetheless everybody is getting better off in some measurable sense, but you also start generating opportunities for politics to deal with those problems without causing huge fiscal and monetary problems. And so one of the problems I argue recently is if you combine with very clear stress points in our societies in which essentially growth is zero, then governments, and you have also, of course, the aging process, which is generating constant fiscal pressure, and as you know, pensions and health, you have governments which are constantly under pressure to spend money that they can't raise politically acceptably way, and then the result is essentially everybody runs colossal fiscal deficits, which we can't do forever, and they're all going to expect the central bank to bail them out. So that does seem to me a way in which the combination of the demands on the public sector with extremely low growth and therefore chronically deficient revenue situation, it creates a political crisis which is seen as a failure of the state. And one of the things populist politicians tend to do is to say, that's not a problem. It's these experts who are telling you that budgets have to balance. That's all crap. And these central banks who say that they can't lower interest rates, that's all crap. That's what Donald Trump is saying. That's exactly what he's saying. And it's not terribly difficult, I do discuss this in some writings, to imagine politicians saying much the same in European countries, and they'll end up talking to you. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's obvious they're going to end up talking to you. So it does seem to me, once you start thinking about the pressures on the state, slow growth itself can be a very, very big problem, even if it isn't associated with radical shifts into income distribution. But the most important conclusion I've reached in this, which is not very much help in my thinking about this, but everything is connected with everything else in really complicated ways. So I'm not saying that it's obvious to me there is some simple magic trick we can do that will solve all the problems we now face that are causing populism. I'll add one other thing, which I haven't said in the presentation, but it's very important. I do think that the financial crisis itself was a staggeringly strong blow for populism. And for the very obvious reasons. There are two things about the financial crisis, any financial crisis, particularly this one, very clear from the literature, very clear. It's massively politically destabilizing event for two reasons. One, a big financial crisis tends to be followed by a large recession or a prolonged period of weakness, and people recognize that's happened, and they don't like it. Second, big financial crises are clearly associated with the failures of identifiable people. Bankers, everybody else in the financial sector, and the people who oversee them, namely the politicians in the financial sector and the central banks. And you can't think of more elite groups in society than those. So they think, sorry, that's what Trump represented. They're all crooks. Mm-hmm. It's a destruction of confidence in the elite of the system. A financial sector is and finally, worst of all, they're all bailed out. So I argue in great length in my book, no single event has done more damage to the credibility of our system. There are many other, but none single than the scale and intensity of the financial crises between 2007 and 2015, and it will take a very, very long time for the people to forget this. There are other things going on, but this is one of the processes that I think have radicalized our society. So it is very important the guys like you doing your jobs do them well.
Well, we hope so. I will continue taking advantage of my position because I would like to refer, talking about the happiness and the happiness of the people of the rank and file that you alluded to, and that I think that is a real hot topic in Europe: immigration.
Yeah.
I think that is indispensable. When you look at the demographics of Europe, I think that is the only, is totally necessary.
It is inevitably going to happen.
But simultaneously, if you look at the radical, both from the right and the left, political groups, they are raising continuously anti-immigration points. How do you read that kind of situation? Do you think that because, well, we are an aging society, we need it. I come from Spain. In Spain, we have a lot of immigrants. And it was not a problem at all. Perhaps because it was South American people coming with a similar culture, language, religion, etc., etc., etc. But now I have started to see that, a political party that is raising continuously the issue of immigration, is becoming more and more successful in terms of the polls and in terms of the elections. What's your view on
this is
your perspective?
Again, I discussed this great length in my book on the crisis of democratic capitalism. So it's such a huge issue, and that's why I touch on it so little. I have the following elements of thinking about it. First, we know that no means universally, but one of the ways certain sorts of populist politics operates is, and we can see this superbly in the US, I mean, that's it obviously, is the populist politician, entrepreneur, articulates his, they've always been men, as far as I can see, position by saying, I represent you, the ordinary people, ordinary, decent, hardworking people of this country. You have two enemies, or three. The predatory elites, the incompetents, the crooks. Two, foreigners. And three, particularly foreign people here who are causing all the crime and destroying your civilization and stealing all your money and all that. So you get a political movement which attacks simultaneously the powerful elite, and there are differences, and the outsiders. And God, you can see this, right? Through history and now. And this is brilliant politics because it satisfies people's demand, and we can't get away from this, for scapegoats. People get great pleasure of finding scapegoats. It's pretty obvious. If you read one of the great books of British historical analysis, Norman Cohen's The Pursuit of the Millennium, it talks about a different form of populists, the millennialists. They tend to operate in the same way. The people who are in league with the devil are the outsiders. Anyway, so that combination works. And it works particularly well when people feel under stress for other reasons. Now, it's clear, and then they get to the second thing. I think it's very, very important to make, how do you deal with this? I think there are two necessary conditions for dealing with it, but I'm not saying they're sufficient. I don't know. We'll see. One is to make clear you are choosing who are immigrating. That is to say, you do control your borders. And it seems to me, I'm very struck in the British debate, there's far more complaint about the relatively small number of people coming in boats than there is about regular immigration. And I think the idea here of people is we need to know who they are, and we need to have chosen them in some sense. So I do think it is a necessary condition for a successful democracy that it appears to have control over its borders. I mean, in Europe, it's of course collective, but it's the same point. That seems to me very, very important. But it also is necessary to put forward, for the reasons you've outlined, that we're going to need foreign workers. And we will know who they are. We give them permission to work here for a certain time or period. It's clear what the rules are. We can have different rules. They will be subject to all the normal laws. They pay taxes and all the rest of it. And we will say, certainly, if they are to become citizens, that they have to learn our language, learn our culture, become part of it. There are rules for this. It's not, but I think there is a reasonable chance, pretty good chance, that if you explain this properly, people will accept it. It is, of course, alas, unfortunately true, that differences in ethnicity, race, whatever that means, religion, so forth, make all this more difficult. And but I think that can be managed. But those are, I think, you have to get away from the politics, which we've seen, obviously, and you have to have proactive statement. This is your policy, this is how your policy works, this is why we need them, and this is how we're going to choose. You can't just let it happen, in my view. Because it is inescapable, and there isn't any serious alternative. But I do think, looking back on it, we made some pretty big mistakes in how we handle this. But really bad politicians, bad people, will use the presence of foreigners as a way to create divisions within society and to create this intense conflict over the outsiders within, and that can lead to truly catastrophic results and tragic results. And I think we're seeing this now, and it frightens me a great deal. If you talk to my American friends, the operation of ICE is probably the single thing that frightens them most.
Very. I suppose in order to, diversify a little bit, because Esther, I don't know whether, we have, some questions from our online audience.
Yeah, there are some questions from the online audience, a couple of them. So the first one is, what safeguards or institutions could have been built from the start, so meaning decades ago, to prevent this rupture? And the second one is more looking at the ECB, and is, what can the ECB do to work against this crisis of the world order, other than, of course, deliver on its mandate?
Well, I would say there are two things which I suppose do fall, broadly speaking, within the ECB. You will correct me about the... let's not have another big surge of inflation. Thank you very much. It would be very good not to do that again. Deliver on your mandate. I am very worried, I discussed this over lunch here, about financial fragility. And I'm very worried I don't think this will be the fault of the ECB, but I am worried about further financial crises and some of the policies that are being pursued. So I hope the people who think about this in the world, and certainly in Europe, are on top of what's going on in our financial sector, and though I think it's far less dangerous than other places in the world, but you have to think about where that is going. What was the first question? Sorry. Yes. That's a really, okay. I don't have much time left yet, so the 4 minutes. In retrospect, I think we spent, and I include myself, far too little time in the Western world thinking about what China would mean and how we took a very laissez-faire approach to what was going on, largely because I think we gigantically underestimated the significance of its rise and the speed. And when I look back on it, there was one area where I clearly understood from the beginning that the tendency of China to become a massive surplus country in the world trading system will be hugely macroeconomically and microeconomically destabilizing. That I was clear on, and I wrote about this, started in the early 2000s. And I think it played a big role in the financial crisis, by the way, Chinese surplus saving. But on the industrial policy and how to handle China's successful industrial policies, we didn't really devote any thought, and now we are very late in the game. So I think that was a mistake, and we should have been far more proactive in thinking about that. And then the second thing is really related to that. There are lots of other things. There are a few countries that I think have done this quite well, but I don't think we have been proactive enough in thinking, in Europe particularly, Denmark, for example, but thinking about the following. We are going through, and have been going through, and will continue, some really giant technological upheavals and competitiveness upheavals associated with China. This creates the need for people to change their jobs, their activities, their locations quite radically. And we have tended, I think, to be very laissez-faire, not about income support. There's sort of income, particularly in Europe. In America, they'd be much more laissez-faire. But the question about how can you proactively help give people the resources to learn the skills that they will need as they move from one thing to another. I think we've found, certainly Britain, it's very strikingly so, whole regions that have collapsed. The collapse of industry has hollowed out entire regions. And once that happens, it's really hard for people to build that back up. I think that's also what's happened in the US. And it's part of what you're seeing in terms of the despair. I write this in the book. I think we should have been much more proactive. These ideas, it's more than adjustment assistance. My wife is the expert on skills training and so forth. I think we could have been much better. A few countries, particularly in the Nordics, seem to me to have been particularly good at this, but people were abandoned. And they felt they were abandoned, and they feel they were abandoned. And I think that must be true in some parts of Europe. I know parts of Italy where this is the case. And that was a tremendous political failure, because you can't support a liberal economic system without dealing, I think, head on. It's not something I last thought 30 years ago, but I certainly do now, without dealing with the casualties. You can't expect people in a liberal democratic society to say, okay, I'm on the trash heap and I'm going to accept it. That doesn't work. That was a big mistake.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think that we are reaching the end of our time. I would like, to thank you, and my gratitude is twofold. First, because you have referred, to a different perspective to the one that we normally, deal with, in a central bank.
Of course.
And I think that that's very important, that the connection.
It's a bigger world.
Yes, for sure. Going beyond the natural interest rate and the models on the output gap. Huh? So that's my first gratitude, element of gratitude to you. The second one is because of the defense of the liberal values. I think that that's key in this world. For those who believe, and I think that around this audience we have a lot of them, in the values of the rule of law, the respect for the minorities, free press, well, I think that your contribution is key. And so I want to express my gratitude to you, and that's why I ask for an applause for Martin Wolf.